The road into Hollow Creek was narrow and serpentine, swallowed by trees that seemed older than sin itself. Mist hung low, clinging to the bark like a secret unwilling to be told. The journalist had driven for hours, guided only by the whisper of an old map and the echo of letters signed with no name. Each one had carried the same haunting phrase: "They tried to silence us, but the woods still remember." As dusk sank into the valley, the car's headlights cut through a fog so dense it felt alive. That's when he saw it, a shape on the horizon, the silhouette of a farmhouse left to die. Its roof sagged, its windows were nothing but hollow eyes staring back. The air smelled of wet earth and something faintly metallic, like old blood that had learned how to hide. When he stepped out, the woods were silent. Not the natural kind of silence, but something deeper, like the world itself was holding its breath. A broken swing hung from the porch, swaying though there was no wind. Beside it lay a child's shoe, the fabric stiff with age and dirt. He approached the door, each step echoing in the stillness. The wood groaned as if recognizing the weight of his trespass. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The walls were lined with faded photographs of women, some young, some worn, all marked by the same eerie symbol, a black line drawn across their mouths. Beneath the pictures lay a single candle, melted down to its stub, as if someone had been keeping vigil long after the light had gone. Then came the sound, a faint knock, not from the door, but from beneath the floorboards. Once. Twice. Then silence again. The journalist froze. The letters had warned him the women were voiceless. But standing in that house, he realized something far more terrifying: silence doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes, it means someone is still listening. The journey began with a single envelope, yellowed by age, the edges curling as though it had waited too long to be opened. Inside was a letter written in trembling handwriting, unsigned, carrying only a few cryptic lines. Asterisk: "They tried to bury our voices in the woods. Find Hollow Creek before the earth does." Asterisk: for a seasoned journalist from Atlanta, used to sensational headlines and urban scandals, it seemed like a strange invitation to madness. Yet something about those words stirred an uneasy curiosity, the kind that keeps a man awake long after midnight. Within days, he packed his camera, his recorder, and a notebook, leaving behind the city's noise for the desolate stretch of southern Alabama, where legends of lost families and buried sins had faded into whispers. The deeper he drove into the countryside, the more it felt like time itself was unraveling. Gas stations disappeared, road signs vanished, and cell reception died miles before the town ever appeared on a map. Each mile pressed heavier on him as the trees grew denser and the horizon darker. Locals at a roadside diner stared when he mentioned Hollow Creek, their faces tensed, conversations broke mid-sentence, and a waitress simply shook her head, muttering, "Best leave that place alone." It wasn't fear of superstition that silenced them, it was fear of memory. But the journalist was not a man to turn back when faced with warning. The more people avoided his questions, the more determined he became to uncover what everyone else seemed desperate to forget. The final stretch of the road felt almost unreal, lined with trees so close they seemed to knit together, their branches forming a canopy that blotted out the sun. When the tires finally crunched over the dirt leading to a decaying wooden sign * Hollow Creek Township, estimated 1891 *, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The town was barely a shadow of life. A few houses leaned toward ruin, their paint peeling in strips, porches sagging, windows empty. Yet there was something else there, something unseen that lingered in the air, thick and watchful. He parked beside what used to be a general store and stepped out. The sound of his own breathing was the only proof he wasn't trapped in some dream. The woods surrounded everything, pressing close, whispering with every faint movement of the wind. Somewhere among those trees, he knew, the story waited, the one that had forced its way into his mailbox, the one written not in ink but in the silence of women who had been forced to forget how to speak. The first sight of the farmhouse came like an apparition breaking through the mist, its outline forming slowly against the tangled forest that had nearly consumed it. The journalist parked the car at the edge of the clearing, his headlights cutting through the fog and landing on the structure that seemed older than the land itself. The house stood crooked, its frame bent as though it had carried too many years of grief. Vines crept up the sides, twisting around broken shutters, and the front porch slanted toward the earth, one post snapped clean in two. It looked less like a home and more like a grave that had forgotten to close. Every instinct in him screamed to stay away, yet the weight of curiosity, of purpose, drew him closer. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of stillness that follows after something terrible has happened. As he approached, the scent of decay thickened, the damp wood mixing with the faintest trace of something metallic beneath it. Each step onto the porch released a groan that echoed through the hollowness inside. The front door was locked, but the frame was so rotten that it gave way with a gentle push. Inside, dust floated through the air like ash suspended in twilight. Furniture lay overturned, a broken lamp on the floor, and a thin layer of leaves had gathered near the windows, carried by years of storms sneaking through shattered glass. The wallpaper, once patterned with soft floral prints, had peeled away in long, curling strips, revealing the skeletal boards beneath. He moved cautiously, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of wood beneath his boots, the creak of a ceiling beam, the slow drip of water from somewhere unseen. On one wall, faint scratches etched into the plaster caught his attention. They were small and uneven, as if carved by shaking hands. Beneath the marks, he found faint initials, letters that looked feminine, almost delicate. The air around them felt colder, sharper. He took a step back and noticed the faint outline of something painted across the far wall, a series of black lines, faded but still visible. At first he thought they were scratches too, until he realized they formed the shape of mouths, several of them, crossed out. The deeper he went, the more the house began to feel alive, breathing with the echo of what it had witnessed. The silence wasn't empty, it was listening. A rusted mirror leaned against the far corner, and for a split second, he thought he saw movement in its reflection, a flicker of something just beyond the frame. He turned, but the room was still. Only the soft rustle of the woods outside reminded him he wasn't completely alone. Somewhere beyond those walls, the forest waited, holding the same secret the house had refused to let go. The next morning, the journalist drove into the nearest town, a place that looked as though time had stopped trying. The streets were nearly empty. The few buildings that remained standing looked sunken from years of neglect, and a dull grayness seemed to have settled over everything like a film that would never wash away. The name of the town had faded from the welcome sign, but the locals still called it Hollow Bend. It was the closest settlement to Hollow Creek, and if anyone knew the truth about the farmhouse, it would be someone there. He parked beside a small diner with flickering neon lights and walked in, the bell above the door giving a weak chime. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and dust. The patrons, all older men with weathered faces, stopped mid-conversation the moment he entered. Their eyes followed him as he took a seat at the counter, the silence stretching too long to be polite. He ordered coffee, trying to appear casual, and began asking about the old farmhouse near the woods. The reaction was instant and unnerving. One man coughed and left his stool. Another buried his face deeper into his newspaper. The waitress froze, her hand tightening around the coffee pot before she forced a strained smile and said she didn't know what he was talking about. But the journalist had seen that look before, the kind that comes when truth and terror lie side by side. He pressed gently, mentioning Hollow Creek by name, and the waitress's expression shifted, her voice faltering just slightly as she said, "Best not to go poking around out there, honey. Some places don't want to be remembered." After a few moments, an older man sitting near the window spoke without looking up. His voice was rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. "You're from the city, aren't you? City folks come here thinking they can fix what's already been buried. You'll end up just like the rest if you ain't careful." Before the journalist could respond, the man stood, paid his bill, and left, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The room fell silent again. When the journalist reached for his check, he noticed something slipped under the edge of his cup, a folded piece of paper, small enough to fit in a child's hand. He opened it discreetly. The handwriting was shaky, the ink faded, but the message was clear. Don't go near Hollow Creek after dark. He looked up, scanning the diner, but no one met his gaze. The waitress avoided his eyes entirely, pretending to clean an already spotless counter. As he stepped outside, a faint wind stirred through the streets, carrying with it the smell of rain and something older, fear that had never really gone away. It was then he realized the town wasn't protecting the secret of Hollow Creek out of ignorance. They were protecting themselves from remembering it. The farmhouse had grown even quieter by the time the journalist returned, as if the air itself resented being disturbed. The sun was beginning to sink behind the trees, casting a dim orange glow through the cracks in the wooden walls. He stepped cautiously inside, every sound magnified by the hollow emptiness of the rooms. Dust rose in lazy spirals with each step, catching the fading light like drifting ash. He had brought his camera this time, determined to capture whatever traces of life the house still held. When he reached the narrow hallway that stretched toward the back rooms, he noticed something he hadn't seen before: a warped cabinet tucked against the wall, its doors half broken, as though someone had tried to hide it rather than use it. He knelt down and forced one of the doors open, revealing a stack of old boxes buried beneath torn lace curtains and rusted picture frames. Inside the top box were photographs, hundreds of them, all in sepia tones, each one carefully wrapped in yellowing paper. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled one free. The first image showed a woman standing in front of the same farmhouse decades earlier. She looked young but weary, her eyes hollow even though she managed a faint smile. But what struck him most wasn't her expression, it was the heavy black line drawn across her mouth, thick and deliberate. He took another photo, and another. Every single woman in every single picture bore the same mark. Some were adults, others no older than children, yet all had been silenced in the same haunting way. The photographs weren't labeled, but behind a few, faint pencil notations had been scribbled initials, dates, and sometimes single words like spring, river, or lost. He noticed that many of the women appeared more than once, sometimes growing older between images, sometimes disappearing entirely. In some pictures, men stood beside them, their faces blurred or scratched out with a blade. A chill passed through him as he realized these weren't random family portraits, they were records, deliberate and methodical. Whoever had taken them wanted to preserve the memory of control, not affection. As he continued sorting through the pile, a photograph slipped from his hands and landed face down. On the back, written in faint ink, were words that made his pulse quicken. Asterisk, we were told not to speak, but the woods will remember our names. Asterisk, the message seemed impossibly personal, as if meant for him. He glanced around the room, the silence suddenly pressing closer, the air colder. Somewhere beyond the broken windows, the forest stirred with a sound that could have been wind or whispers carried through the trees, the voices of the women whose faces stared at him from the fading paper, mouths forever marked by silence. As dusk thickened around the farmhouse, the journalist set up a small lantern on the floor, its glow trembling against the cracked walls. The box of photographs still sat open beside him, but something beneath it had caught his attention, a warped wooden board that didn't quite match the rest of the flooring. He pried it loose with a penknife, revealing a hollow compartment filled with dust, moth-eaten cloth, and a small leather-bound book. The cover was brittle, its corners darkened by time, but faint letters could still be read across the surface. Asterisk Clara emmed at asterisk. He brushed away the dirt carefully and opened the diary, its pages fragile and yellowed, the handwriting delicate yet hurried, as though written in fear. The first entries spoke of ordinary life, sewing, tending to the garden, feeding chickens, but as the pages turned, the tone shifted. Clara wrote of the woods, of nights when the air grew heavy and the house filled with strange sounds. Then her words began to unravel into confession. She described a man she only called him, someone who ruled the house with silence and dread. The women were forbidden to leave, forbidden even to speak unless he permitted it. The penalty for disobedience was isolation in what she called the cold room beneath. The writing grew shakier as the diary went on, blotches of ink smearing the paper where tears had fallen. One entry read, asterisk, he says our voices bring shame, that the world cannot hear us, that the blood we share is both curse and gift. Asterisk. As the journalist turned another page, he found pressed between two sheets a lock of hair, pale and brittle, tied with a faded ribbon. Underneath it, Clara's tone changed again. The words became desperate. She wrote of her sister, Anna, who had tried to run through the woods one night but never returned. After that, the diary spoke of strange gatherings in the cellar, the sound of chains, and the way the others had begun to forget how to speak altogether. The final entry was short, scrawled as though written in the dark, asterisk, if anyone finds this, tell the world we were here. He took our words, but not our souls. The trees will remember for us. Asterisk. The journalist's pulse quickened as he read the last line. The diary felt alive in his hands, pulsing with grief and memory. He looked around the room again, the faint creak of the walls echoing like a whisper. For the first time, he understood the photographs, the black lines across the mouths. They weren't marks of shame. They were symbols of resistance, the women's way of speaking when speech had been stolen. That night, the forest around the farmhouse felt different, as though the air itself had begun to breathe. The journalist couldn't sleep. The weight of Clara's diary pressed against his mind, its final words looping over and over like an unfinished echo. He sat near the window, watching the woods sway in the dim silver light of the moon. Everything seemed unnervingly still until, sometime past midnight, a sound broke the quiet, a faint, drawn-out cry that rose and vanished almost as quickly as it came. At first, he told himself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a nightbird, but there was something undeniably human in the tone, something raw and pleading. He stepped outside with his flashlight, the beam cutting through mist that hung low and thick, rolling like smoke between the trees. The sound came again, softer this time, drifting from deep within the forest. He called out, his voice swallowed almost instantly by the vastness of the night. There was no response, only the distant rustle of branches. He followed the noise anyway, his boots sinking into the damp earth, the cold seeping through his clothes. The deeper he went, the heavier the silence grew, until even the crickets stopped singing. It was as if the forest had been waiting for him. The cries began again, overlapping now, faint but distinct, multiple voices, each trembling with something between sorrow and warning. They weren't words, just broken sounds that rose and fell like breath against the trees. His flashlight flickered. For a split second, the beam illuminated what looked like movement ahead, a shadow slipping between the trunks, too fast to define. He froze, his pulse hammering in his throat. The air felt colder now, and the smell of earth grew sharp and metallic, the same scent he'd noticed inside the farmhouse. The voices began to circle him, soft and uneven, coming from all directions at once. He turned in every direction, but there was nothing there, only trees, endless and identical, pressing closer. He stumbled backward, tripping over a root, and landed hard on the ground. The moment his palms touched the soil, the voices stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, so deep it rang in his ears. Then, from somewhere just beyond the beam of light, came a whisper, low, trembling, unmistakably human. It said his name. Not shouted, not spoken with anger, but breathed with fragile familiarity, as if someone who had known him long ago was calling from under the earth. He turned the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing, only the soft sway of the pines and the faint impression of movement in the mist. The air pulsed once more, then went utterly still. He ran back toward the farmhouse, not daring to look behind him. Even after he slammed the door shut, the faint echo of that voice lingered in his mind, whispering through the silence, refusing to let him rest. The morning light crept reluctantly into the farmhouse, thin and grey, as if afraid to touch what lingered there. The journalist hadn't slept. The whisper from the woods still pulsed through his memory, every syllable of his name replaying in the silence like a warning. He returned to the diary, tracing Clara's final words again and again until his eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before. At the very bottom of one page, faintly pressed into the paper, were small indentations, numbers arranged like coordinates. His heart quickened. He recognized them not as a place in the forest but as something closer. The measurements seemed to match the layout of the house itself. He began to follow them, pacing across the creaking floorboards, the numbers guiding him toward the main parlor where the dust was thickest. There, near the corner, the boards gave a hollow sound when he tapped them. He dropped to his knees, brushing the dirt aside until his fingers found a seam barely visible in the wood. Using the same penknife from before, he pried it open. The smell that escaped was dense and old, the scent of rot and rust mingled with something sharper, like forgotten iron. Beneath the floor was a trapdoor, its handle corroded but still intact. He hesitated, listening. The house was silent, the kind of silence that waited. Then he pulled. The door opened with a groan that seemed to come from the house's bones. A black void yawned beneath him. The air that rose from it was cold enough to sting. He lowered his lantern, and the faint glow revealed a narrow wooden ladder descending into darkness. Each step creaked under his weight as he climbed down, the air growing heavier with every breath. When his feet touched the ground, his light swept across the cellar, and what it revealed froze him in place. The walls were stone, carved roughly, damp with condensation. Along them, chains hung in neat rows, some rusted through, others still strong enough to hold. Near the far corner stood a table littered with objects that looked like medical instruments, scalpels, clamps, tools that didn't belong in any home. And everywhere, scratched into the stone, were initials. Dozens of them. Some large, some small, each carved with a desperate, trembling hand. He touched one and felt how deep it had been etched, as if the person had spent hours pressing into the rock. Above the markings, faintly painted in what looked like dark pigment, were words he could barely read. Asterisk, we were told to be still. Asterisk. He turned slowly, the lantern flickering. For a moment, he thought he heard the faint sound of chains shifting, though none moved. The air vibrated softly, a low hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. He realized then that this was the cold room beneath Clara had written about, the place where silence had been forced, where voices had been broken until only echoes remained. The day after discovering the cellar, the journalist drove back toward Hollow Bend, the weight of what he had seen pressing into his chest like a physical ache. He needed answers, something to tether the horror to reality. He began asking quietly around town again, but most people turned away before he could finish a sentence. Then, a woman at the post office, her voice barely above a whisper, told him there was someone he should see, a woman named Mrs. Ellison who lived at the county hospice on the edge of town. She had been at Hollow Creek, the woman said, many years ago, though no one spoke of how or why. He followed the directions she gave him, a winding road that led to a small brick building surrounded by weeping willows and the faint scent of disinfectant in the air. Inside, the hospice was dim and quiet, the corridors lined with old photographs of smiling nurses and patients long gone. The receptionist pointed him toward the far end of the hall, where Mrs. Ellison's room sat alone, her name written in shaky pen on the doorplate. When he entered, the room was small and almost bare, just a bed, a nightstand, and a window that overlooked the trees. The woman lying there was frail, her skin pale and thin as parchment. Her eyes, however, were startlingly clear, sharp in a way that made him hesitate. When he introduced himself and mentioned Hollow Creek, her fingers tightened around the edge of her blanket. She didn't speak. Instead, her gaze drifted toward a small notebook resting on the nightstand. He picked it up and handed it to her, and with trembling hands she began to write. Her movements were slow but deliberate. When she turned the pad around, 3 words stared back at him in crooked letters. Asterisk, I remember everything. Asterisk, he asked gently about the farmhouse, about the cellar, about the name Clara. She paused after each question, her breathing shallow, before scribbling responses in fragments. Yes, sisters, never allowed outside, voices taken. Each word carried the weight of a lifetime. Tears welled in her eyes as she wrote a final sentence, her hand shaking so badly that the letters nearly vanished into the paper. Asterisk, he said we were his blood and his curse. Asterisk. The journalist felt the air grow thick between them. When he asked if the man she wrote about was still alive, she simply looked toward the window, her expression tightening with something that resembled fear. Her fingers moved again, slowly spelling out a final message. Asterisk, the woods don't let him go. Asterisk, then she dropped the pen. The silence in the room deepened, and for a moment he thought he heard the faint sound of wind through the trees outside, though the branches were still. The drive back from the hospice was long and wordless, the road winding through fields that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath a low grey sky. The journalist replayed every detail of Mrs. Ellison's trembling handwriting, each word tightening the noose of dread that had already begun to form around his thoughts. He had come to Alabama chasing whispers, but now those whispers had taken form, living, breathing through the testimony of a woman who had survived something beyond comprehension. Back at the farmhouse, the air felt colder, heavier, as if the land itself knew he was close to uncovering what it had spent decades trying to bury. He spread the photographs, the diary, and Mrs. Ellison's written notes across the dusty floor, arranging them like pieces of a puzzle. The truth began to emerge in fragments, stitched together through Clara's words and the faint memories left behind. The man Clara called him was no stranger to those woods. He had been the patriarch of the Hollow Creek family, a figure both feared and revered in the nearby town, a preacher, a man who twisted faith into a weapon and blood into ritual. Generations had grown beneath his roof, and with each generation, the line between father, husband, and child blurred until no one could tell one from the other. The women were not wives by choice, nor daughters by right, they were bound to him through terror and silence. The marks on their photographs, the lines across their mouths, were acts of defiance, signs of the voices he had stolen but could never truly erase. The townspeople had known. That realization hit the journalist harder than anything else. The silence in Hollow Bend wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. For years, people had chosen to look away, to pretend the screams carried by the wind were just echoes of the forest. When one woman disappeared, they said she'd left for the city. When another gave birth in secret, they said the father was a stranger. The cycle had continued, generation after generation, hidden behind sermons, tradition, and the dense wall of the woods. In one of Clara's final entries, written in shaky ink that trailed off mid-sentence, she described a night of fire, the townspeople setting the edge of the forest ablaze, believing they could destroy the sickness by burning the house to the ground. But the house didn't burn. It stood, blackened but unbroken, and the family within vanished into the darkness. The patriarch's bloodline scattered through the trees, leaving only fragments behind, children born of confusion, raised in silence, and taught to forget. Reading her words, the journalist realized Hollow Creek had not just been a place of tragedy, it had been a prison built by generations who mistook secrecy for survival, and now he was the first outsider to step inside it and truly listen. The discovery came on the final night, when the air over Hollow Creek felt so still it seemed even the forest had stopped breathing. The journalist had decided to leave by morning, his mind worn thin by everything he had seen and heard. But something in Clara's diary kept gnawing at him, a brief passage written in fading ink, one that mentioned the grave that hums with memory. It was a line he had dismissed before, but now, under the weight of what he knew, it felt like an unfinished sentence demanding to be completed. Lantern in hand, he stepped outside into the mist-draped woods. The trees loomed like sentinels, their shadows long and skeletal under the moonlight. He followed the path behind the farmhouse, guided by the faint impression of footprints pressed into the damp soil, as though someone else had recently walked there. The further he went, the more the sounds of the night faded. Then, in a small clearing, he saw it, a patch of earth sunken and uneven, marked not by a cross or stone but by a rusted tin can driven into the ground. Something glinted faintly beside it, half buried in mud. He knelt and brushed away the dirt until his fingers struck metal. It was an old handheld recorder, its body rusted but intact. When he pressed one of the buttons, to his shock, the device whirred weakly to life, its single red light flickering. Then came the sound, a crackle of static, followed by a voice. The tone was fragile but steady, a woman's voice, each word drawn out like a confession whispered in the dark. She spoke of the nights in the cellar, of the children who never learned to speak, of the man whose shadow filled every corner of the house. Her words trembled with fear and resolve, describing how she had hidden the recorder in the woods so the truth could outlive her. "If you hear this," the voice said, "you found where we rest. Don't let him be forgotten. Don't let the silence win again." The tape ended with a faint sound, something between a sob and a breath, and then nothing but static. The journalist sat frozen, his heart hammering, the wind beginning to stir through the trees again as though the forest itself had been listening. He looked toward the farmhouse, its roof barely visible through the mist, and understood what the letters, the photographs, and the whispers had all been leading to. The story had never been about uncovering a crime, it was about remembering what the world had chosen to forget. As he rose, the faint hum of the recorder continued, a trembling note that seemed to vibrate through the earth beneath his feet, as if the voices buried there were still trying to speak, refusing to be silenced even in death.